Good afternoon to you all, a hearty bunch, following a lunch, and Larry Arnn. It's good to have you here. My name is Kris Mauren, M-A-U-R-E-N, and I'm with the Acton Institute. Now, Lord Acton was the fellow that said power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I hasten to assure you, Anita, I won't let the power of the gavel go to my head. I will execute my duties faithfully, which are simply to introduce our panelists and to follow up with your questions afterwards. But I want to start by congratulating Hillsdale on this, the 10th annual Free Market Forum. It's really been spectacular. I've been lucky, graced to be on the planning committee on an annual basis for this event, but of course, all the credit goes to Anita for putting it together and to the Durrell Foundation for their vision and generosity in making this a reality on an annual basis. So really, thank you to both of them. Now, when Anita asked me if I would be the moderator for this panel, the first thing that came to my senses was Friedrich Bastiat. Who here knows that name? I thought so. This is Hillsdale, after all. Now, if you're a Hillsdale undergraduate, you're not allowed to graduate without being introduced to Friedrich Bastiat, I'm certain, as well as Hayek and Mises and Friedman and other great luminaries of the free market movement. I wasn't so fortunate to go to Hillsdale, but I was lucky enough to stumble upon Bastiat as an undergraduate. And what came to my mind as we were thinking about entitlements and debt was this particular quote by Bastiat. It is this: the state is that great fiction by which everyone tries to live at the expense of everyone else. Now, I hasten to say that I am not an anarchist. I believe government should do some things. Don't ask me what those should be. But before I proceed to introducing our panel and the topic, I also have to make a comment about Larry Arnn. I don't know if he's in the room. I wouldn't want to puff up his head too much, but Larry spoke about some pretty serious things. I see him, he's back there. Hi, Larry. Now, I've heard Larry speak dozens of times, easily dozens of times, and I'm inspired every time. He's so erudite, smart, clever, well-studied, uses big words. And try as he might, he can't depress me. I'm not depressed. He speaks to our noblest aspirations and visions for our society, and somehow it's not depressing. So if you're like me and you weren't depressed that Larry said civilization itself is at stake in the next few weeks, don't worry, this panel is going to fix that. Because I'm not going to sugarcoat it. A panel on debt and entitlements is bound to be a little bit depressing. And I know you, fellow panelists here, aren't alchemists or miracle workers, but I'm going to challenge you, if possible, at some point to help us see a way forward, despite the very dire information you will share. Now, onto the panel. I'm going to break a little bit with past moderators, and I'm going to introduce each of them right now, and they will come up in turn. So, to my far right, and time will tell whether that's true, is R.J. Pestritto. R.J., otherwise known as Ron by Anita, is the Dean of the Graduate School of Statesmanship at Hillsdale College, and he holds the Charles and Lucia Shipley Chair in the American Constitution. He serves as a senior fellow of the college's Kirby Center and is also a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. He earned his BA from Claremont McKenna and his MA and PhD in government from Claremont Graduate University. He's an expert on Woodrow Wilson and has 2 books, Woodrow Wilson and the Roots of Modern Liberalism, and the editor of Woodrow Wilson, The Essential Political Writings. He's also the co-editor of the American Progressivism, a reader, and he will be speaking to us on the principles of the entitlement state. Now, first on my left is Nick Eberstadt. Nick holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at AEI, where he researches and writes extensively on demographics and economic development. And it's hard to keep up with Nick, and I'm grateful you didn't put all your books on here. It would be here all afternoon. Nick is also a senior advisor to the National Bureau of Asian Research. His latest book is Men Without Work, America's Invisible Crisis. His wisdom needs to be heard everywhere, and it is quite often. You'll hear him on NPR and many other media sources. At the Acton Institute, we brought him to Rome to try to bring some wisdom there, in fact. He will be speaking about the growth of entitlements. And finally, in my far left, and I know this isn't true, is Mike Needham. Mike is the CEO of Heritage Action for America, a grassroots advocacy organization created in April 2010 by the Heritage Foundation. Prior to becoming CEO of Heritage Action, Needham worked on former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani's presidential campaign. All right, Needham was previously a director and chief of staff of the Heritage Foundation. He's a native New Yorker, has degrees from Stanford and Williams College. He's also in the news on a very regular basis. Undoubtedly, you've seen them. Ladies and gentlemen, we're very fortunate to have these experts with us today. Let me first welcome RJ to the stage.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming out this afternoon. It's great to see such a large crowd, and I'd like to thank Anita Folsom for inviting me, and Doug Jeffrey as well. This is a new event for me. I think it's the only kind of Hillsdale College event that I haven't been to before. So I'm actually a political theorist by profession, so I don't know about getting up in front of a couple hundred economists. You'll note that I don't have lots of slides, or actually any slides or charts or other fancy things like that to put up in front of you, so you'll have to bear with me, and we'll see how it goes. I've been asked to lay out some of the political first principles of what we are calling on this panel the entitlement state. And most of my own work, as was mentioned in the introduction, has actually been on the progressive era. And surely we couldn't get the entitlement state or this idea of entitlements without the progressives and without the progressives' assault both on our original natural rights principles and also on our limited government constitutionalism. But practically speaking, of course, the idea of entitlements as such really does get launched in the New Deal. And so most of my remarks are going to be, I think, targeted more on FDR, although I'm happy to address questions on the progressives during the Q&A, and I've got some of my paper that's going to be posted addresses the progressives. I will start with them, say a little bit about them, because certainly this is where we get the principled origins of the New Deal. So the argument of the progressives was that we had all of these social and economic changes in the country since the establishment of the American Constitution, and so the reformers in the progressive era argued that the original conception of American government, separation of powers at the national level, its embrace of federalism to distribute power among various levels of government, state, local, and federal, that system really was no longer up to the task of managing a modern nation state. And so the progressives pressed for much greater federal regulation of private business, certainly than what they knew the Constitution allowed, and also federal redistribution of private property. And they had a vision of doing this through a national bureaucracy of experts whom they believed could overcome so much of the corruption that they saw in the political branches of government at that time, and rule instead on the basis of science, on the basis of expertise. So Woodrow Wilson, this was of course long before he became a contender for public office. Wilson was a pioneering progressive intellectual on the new science of national administration. This was a science which Theodore Roosevelt himself put to use in the New Nationalism campaign. That was the theme of his campaign when he ran for president in 1912, which called for national regulation of businesses by means of expert commissions. Wilson himself, though of course he was TR's rival for the presidency in 1912, in fact implemented much of the new nationalism program once he defeated TR. It had to wait for the programs of the New Deal, however, for this vision to be given an opportunity for full implementation. So this ambition for the redistribution of property, or I would say through this development of a system of entitlements, one that was to be overseen by an enlarged bureaucracy, was founded, what I want to sort of argue here, was founded on a new conception of freedom. And we see this new conception of freedom at the heart of the New Deal, but again, it's something that they're getting from the progressive ideas. So progressive and New Deal thinkers, I should say, certainly did not reject the idea of freedom outright. Instead, what they did is to offer a radically new view of what it means to be free. So while the Progressive and New Deal project clearly turned away from the original idea of liberty, that original idea on which America was founded, FDR did speak of what he called new economic freedoms. And these were the new freedoms that were to be secured by the New Deal program. Now, to understand what FDR thought was in fact new about freedom, we have to bear in mind that he again intellectually was a committed progressive, and I don't mean to say that he's a member of the progressive movement, obviously, but rather that he was committed to the ideas of progressivism. And he announced this commitment in many places, but perhaps nowhere is the connection more evident than in his what is called his campaign address on progressive government. That's the address that he gave in 1932, actually in September of 1932. It's also called more commonly the Commonwealth Club Address, which is where he gave the talk. And in that talk, FDR identified his political program explicitly with the two giants of the national progressive movement, that is to say, with Wilson and with Theodore Roosevelt. He names them specifically. In committing to progressive ideas on government, then FDR committed to the wholesale remaking of the American political order that the progressives had initiated a generation earlier. He knew very well that if the New Deal policies were to be implemented, then the American commitment to a limited constitutional government was going to have to be replaced, and it would have to be replaced with a new understanding of the national government as a kind of national problem solver. This would be a transformation of government from one that had been concerned with the much more limited purpose of protecting the individual rights to life, liberty, and property, a transformation of that to one that would constantly adapt itself to handle whatever social ills appear to be the most pressing at any given time. Now, it was in accepting the Democratic nomination in Chicago that FDR pledged himself to what he called a New Deal for the American people. To understand this New Deal, to understand its conception of human liberty, we need to turn to FDR's Commonwealth Club address. FDR explained in the address that there were two ways of understanding liberty in American history, in American political development. The first way was the way of the founders, was the way of 19th century America. This way held that liberty was, as FDR described it, a negative right. It meant that government was merely to secure the conditions whereby individuals could pursue their fortune and happiness in whatever way best suited them, free from centralized direction or guidance. Roosevelt explained that this understanding of liberty had been appropriate for the frontier conditions of early America. He conceded that it had helped to create the great buildup in prosperity that took place in 19th century America. The old kind of freedom, this negative kind of freedom, had facilitated the unchecked greed of the businessman. But now that this unchecked individual enterprise had established the commercial prosperity of America. Now that America was facing a brand new set of economic and social problems, the old understanding of liberty had to be transformed. And the turn of the tide, in FDR's view, had been the settling of the frontier. The kind of individualism that had been necessitated by the frontier was now a threat to the common economic security. And so the previously unchecked growth of the business titans had to be reined in by an increasingly strong central authority. So this expansion of central government authority over the traditional freedom of the individual, FDR knew, was also a transformation in the American understanding of government. And so while he acknowledged in places the continuing importance of rights, he called in his Commonwealth Club address for, quote, the redefinition of these rights in terms of a changing and growing social order. So whereas the founders had understood the rights spoken of in the Declaration of Independence as permanent, as natural rights, that is, as deriving from man's permanent nature, for FDR, the meaning of liberty itself would change as history moved forward. It is in this crucial respect that FDR very much adopted the doctrine of progressivism, which was that the founding era notion of liberty, which might have held that individuals had rights that took precedence over the power of the state, had to be replaced by a new 20th century understanding, because new conditions meant a new meaning of liberty. One where democratic majorities have the liberty to use the power of the centralized state to achieve economic and social justice. So given our focus on entitlements here, this conference and this panel, we should pay very careful attention to a central passage of the Commonwealth Club address. This is where FDR introduces a radically new conception of freedom, I think with some real subtlety. And this observation, I should add, is not original to me. FDR in that address cited the Declaration of Independence. And he rightly notes that the Declaration puts forth a contract understanding of government. And he refers, of course, to the theory of social contract, where according to the founders, according to the political theorists from whom the founders learned this theory, individuals possess rights by nature. These rights come prior to the formation of government, and thus government can only be legitimately empowered by the consent of those who are to be governed. But here's how FDR describes this contract in the speech. He says, quote, under such a contract, rulers were accorded power, and the people consented to that power on consideration that they be accorded certain rights. So according to FDR, the people give power to the government, and the government gives rights to the people. Rights, then, are not naturally or permanently possessed by individuals, but are instead the creation of the state. Rights thus move from being the traditional political rights that we may be most familiar with, liberty, property, and so on, to entitlement rights. The people give more and more power to government so that they can then claim various entitlements from it. Thus, this is the bargain, the more rights one wants, the right to health care, the right to a house, the right to a job, etc., then the more powerful government must become. And so instead of a situation where an expansion on the scope of government might actually be a threat to the liberty of the individual, under FDR's redefinition, our rights increase just as much as we are willing to have the power of government increase. Now, while the Commonwealth Club address is probably the clearest statement of FDR's principles, I think his annual message to Congress in 1944 provides one of the best examples of what these principles mean in terms of concrete entitlement policy. He put these policies in terms of what he called in that address a second Bill of Rights. That is, the older understanding of liberty had led to the first Bill of Rights, the one that you and I know as the actual Bill of Rights. But under the new view of liberty, we must have a new statement of rights. And just as his language in the Commonwealth Club address had suggested, these redefined rights were put forth in the form of entitlements. The more power government is given, the more of these new rights the people can get. And among the many new rights or freedoms that FDR listed were the right to a job, the right to food, clothing, and recreation, the right to a home, the right to medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right not to be afraid of old age, sickness, and unemployment, and the right to a good education. He must have meant a right to a Hillsdale College education, I don't know. But I think the most useful thing about the 1944 address is that in laying out these new freedoms, FDR also reveals that their accomplishment would require an assault on the old freedoms, especially those pertaining to individual property rights. He acknowledges in the address that measures such as a heavy tax on unreasonable profits, a renegotiation of war contracts, various forms of price controls, and other measures would all be necessary, among other things, to bring about his new economic freedoms. And thus, with the Commonwealth Club address, with the 1944 annual message, we have two documents from FDR that I think really get at the core of what freedom means for him and for America. And we see how the birth of the entitlement state relies upon a fundamentally new view of rights. As FDR says in that 1944 address, quote, "True individual freedom cannot exist without economic security." And when he lays out the new Bill of Rights in that same address, he sums them up by saying, all of these rights spell security. And that, in the end, is what I would suggest we focus on when we're asked to speak of the principles, the first principles of the entitlement state. That it requires, as I think both the New Dealers and the progressives well knew, a sacrifice of natural liberty in exchange for a baseline material security under the management of a centralized administrative class. It's this class, of course, as we see from our politics today, that has become so entrenched that it is now defended at all costs by the elites of both major political parties. And it remains to be seen what the prospects are today for turning that around. Thank you.
Do I get a reset? And we've got that up. Let me make sure I know how to make this work. Yes. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. My topic may not be quite so pleasurable, however. I'm going to be talking about a revolution that we have all been living through, a revolutionary transformation in our country, and it is a revolution driven by the seemingly inexorable and unstoppable expansion of the relatively new entitlement state in our country. This expansion of the entitlement state has brought about truly revolutionary changes in our federal government. I think more broadly we can say it has brought revolutionary changes in the general nature of governance in our country. And it has also been occasion for revolutionary changes in what was once unmockingly called the American way of life. I'm going to run through these with the help of some slides in the next few minutes, And I'll also be talking about what I regard as the extremely troubling implications of the continuing expansion of the entitlement state for the nature of citizenship in our country. So, this chart here shows the proportion of total government spending that is allocated to entitlement programs from the end of World War II to the present. And if you can't see those lines very well, they start down at 0 and head up to 80%. I was born in 1956, 55, but I was born, you can see in 56 in there, when the proportion of total federal spending on entitlement programs was about 20%. That wasn't so very different from the proportion of entitlement spending for the federal government back under Herbert Hoover or under Teddy Roosevelt or in some earlier times, because most of what government always did was things that were sort of enumerated in the Constitution, paid attention to defense, to paying the debt, the post office, and things like that. Today, over 70% of federal government spending is earmarked for our entitlement commitments, for our various social welfare guarantees, over $2.03. So this has literally overturned the meaning of the word revolution. This has literally been a revolution in the priorities and allocations and considerations that our federal government devotes itself to. You can see this maybe more clearly if we take a look at the blue line of entitlement commitments in federal spending over this post-war period, and the red line, which is kind of like everything else, everything that isn't entitlements. And we had a crossover in the 1990s, and now you can see basically twice as much is being spent on entitlements as on everything else that the federal government does. And interestingly enough, as far as non-entitlement spending goes, the U.S. government is only commanding a fraction of the resources today that it commanded 50 years earlier for all non-entitlement purposes of federal governance. Of course, it's not just, the government is not just federal, there's state and local, and if we aggregate all of the spending, all of the resource allocations for our entire government at state, local, and federal levels, we see a slightly different picture, but only a slightly different picture. The red line is not entitlements, is everything else. The blue line is entitlements. You can see that we are on track to head for, I think, a very portentous crossover, and it's kind of months away. I mean, it's not many, many years away. You can connect the lines there yourself. You can see how close we are to this truly significant symbolic crossover. This is a map, you might call it, of different entitlement programs and their growth. It's somewhat exaggerated in this chart because it uses current trillions of dollars and neglects the fact that our money isn't worth nearly as much as it was 25 or 50 years ago. So if we control, we still see an absolutely radical increase in these commitments over time. The two colors at the bottom of the chart, the blue and the red, are programs that didn't exist until 1965, until the Great Society. That's Medicaid and Medicare. There's a kind of above the green, there's another kind of dark blue set of programs that really didn't begin until about the beginning of the War on Poverty. These are income maintenance programs. But you can see, and of course the green is Social Security program benefits, which connect with what Ron was talking about, which had their antecedents in the New Deal. But there's been a tremendous continuing increase in entitlement spending, and entitlement spending is now chugging along at a tempo of about $200 billion a month. Yes, that's per month, $200 billion a month. It has transformed daily life in the United States in this respect. This chart here shows the proportion of personal consumption expenditures for America as a whole that are accounted for by these government transfer programs. And back in 1960, it was about, I think just about 7%. Now it's about 21%. It's come down very slightly as the Great Recession has ebbed, but the long-term trend line, I think, is quite clear there. Entitlement income is the very fastest growing item in the American family's budget. It's been growing more than twice as fast as non-entitlement income for over 50 years. And when you do anything exponentially for half a century, you change the world. I'll show you some of the ways that world has been changed. This is a nice map that was put together by our friends at the New York Times. It shows the proportion of income in different counties accounted for by entitlement transfers. And the important thing to know is that the darker the color, the higher the fraction of the county's income accounted for by government transfers. This is 1969, and I'm going to show you what the world looked like 40 years later. Just pay attention to the colors, okay? This is 1969. This is 2009, okay? 69, 2009. 2009 was a terrible recession year. We have to keep that in mind. But if we go back here, we see that things only changed a little bit after that recession, right? So it's not that different today. There's almost no counties in the United States that have as little entitlement dependence today as the most dependent counties 40 years ago. And by the way, lest I seem to be partisan about this, I should point out that the 100 most dependent counties in terms of entitlement in the year 2008, among those 100, 2/3 voted for John McCain, not Barack Obama. We have a very unfortunately bipartisan love affair with the continuing growth, I think, of the entitlement state. This chart may be just a little bit too nerdy and difficult to read, so let me do a little bit of reading to the blind, so to speak. It's kind of funny, but the United States government didn't even bother to start asking how many people are enrolled in different entitlement programs until the late 1970s, when the Census Bureau started a particular survey for following this, almost a generation after this huge expanse had really begun. On the basis of this survey, we can see certain things. We can see that between, I cover about 30 years in this, 83 versus 2012. Over that period of time, the American population increased by about 85 million people. Over that same period of time, the number of Americans enrolled in one or more entitlement programs increased by 86 million people. So the total number of people in the United States who were not in households getting one or more entitlement benefits actually shrunk over those 30 years. Some of that, of course, is programs like Medicare and Social Security, which are pension and health care guarantees for retirees. And you might think that because the United States is becoming a grayer society, that population graying accounts for most of this increased dependent population, if we can talk about it that way. But that would be entirely wrong. Most of the growth of the recipient population in the United States has been for means-tested benefits. While we had an 85 million person increase in our country in terms of total population over this period, we had a 67 million person increase in means-tested benefit receipt or acceptance, however you wish to look at that. And we may be familiar with the welfare reform that occurred about 20 years ago, but that was essentially a one-off. While the total number of people enrolled in that particular program declined, in Medicaid, in what used to be called food stamps, and many other programs, there were really quite dramatic increases. I want to show you the sort of thing that I like to do when I try to use, baby econometrics, and that's to see if there's any sort of correlation between the percentage of Americans receiving means-tested public benefits and the poverty rate. The poverty rate's the blue line. The red line is the proportion of Americans in households receiving means-tested benefits. So what do we see? When the poverty rate goes up, the number of means-tested households goes up. When the poverty rate goes down, the number of means-tested household goes up. When you see, there's actually almost no statistical correlation there. But let's look at the unemployment rate. Same story. Unemployment rate goes up, beneficiaries go up. Unemployment rate goes down, beneficiaries go up. And this happens over a number of decades. I did find in doing some simple statistical analysis that there's one very, very powerful predictor of the proportion of Americans enrolled in means-tested benefit programs, and that's the calendar year. For each additional calendar year, the proportion goes up by about 0.3%, so about 3.5% for each decade. And if that trend continues, we can't say that these trends continue forever, but if it were to continue for another decade or so, the majority of Americans would be in means-tested households who, of course, qualify for these benefits on the basis of income and poverty. So it's a redefining of poverty upwards is what I'm describing. So what are some of the consequences or correlates of this continuing expansion of the entitlement state? I've just written a whole book about one particular question, which is the collapse of work for men. It's Men Without Work, America's Invisible Crisis. Came out last month. It goes into some of that sorry story in much greater detail. But suffice it to say that the rise of the entitlement state has coincided with the collapse of work for men in modern America. The line at the bottom going up rather quickly until the turn of this century is labor force participation by women. The yellowish line in the middle is overall national. The red thing at the top that's kind of like heading south is the labor force participation rate for men in America. And the decline is not just due to population aging. It's a very grim story. You can see this here if we look at that kind of checkered area at the top is a proportion of men who are out of the workforce. The blue is unemployment, the red is employed. There's been a growing flight from work over this long period of time. And actually, we don't look so good compared to some other welfare states and other parts of the world. Men in their late 30s are the ones who are most likely to be at work in any society, any time in history. So I'm looking at men in their late 30s here. The blue line going south, so sadly, is the United States of America. The red line that's kind of struggling to hold on is Greece. So compared to Greece, we don't look so good. just to give you a sense of this. And whatever else we may say about causes and motivations and so forth, this increase in the welfare state may not have caused, well, nobody can prove that it caused this flight from work, but it certainly has helped to finance it. It certainly has helped to finance it. Here's one other aspect of this, which is the transformation of disability programs into what looks very much like a alternative lifestyle program here. If you look at the blue line, that tells the risk of dying during working age. It's been coming rather steadily down. American workers by this index have never been healthier than they are today, working age people. If you look at the red line, however, that's the proportion of Americans enrolled in just one of our many disability programs, SSDI, in comparison to the total number of people in the labor force. So depending upon which you want to pick, Americans are either more disabled than they've ever been in history, or they're healthier than they've ever been in history. You decide on the incentive structure there. I'll just make two more points. No. As economists in the room know, you can correlate any two things, whether they're actually related or not in some causal sort of sense. So what I put on here was the cost of Medicare and Social Security, which is the blue line, kind of exponentially going up, and the deficit, and the U.S. deficit over time. And what you can see is there's a little bit more of a correspondence than would be kind of nice for comfort to have between the spending on Medicare and Medicaid and the increase in our public debt. Now, there are many reasons that I could give you that I would see as legitimate reasons for increasing public debt. You might have a war or a national emergency. We might even argue about certain sorts of projects that could be amortized over time and repaid or so forth. But one thing that's really hard to justify is current consumption to be paid for by future generations of taxpayers. And it kind of looks as we've got that down pretty well in our current arrangements for the entitlement state in America today. One last point, and this is about the extent to which the inexorable growth of the entitlement state seems to be crowding out defense. And of course, defense is the first charge of the president in our Constitution. You can see the red line is not the percentage of GDP devoted to defense. It's the percentage of GDP devoted to entitlements. And the blue line is the proportion devoted to defense. And we had a crossover back under President Nixon, and never the twain shall meet again, apparently. There may be plenty of reasons to think that there is waste, inefficiency, and bloat in our Defense Department. I don't see why it should be different from any of the rest of the government. But what we cannot say is that our defense commitments have become unaffordable. As a proportion of GDP, they have been growing smaller over time. But apparently we need to make them smaller still to keep America safe for the growth of the entitlement state. Thank you very much.
I must say the income inequality panel this morning was far more encouraging than this panel is shaking up to be. Thank you all very much for being here. It's an honor to speak at Hillsdale College. I did not have the privilege of going to Hillsdale College. As Kris mentioned, I went to Williams College, where we were not, in fact, required to read Eberstadt. We got plenty of exposure to Maya Angelou and other great things. As a result, needless to say, I don't have charts for my presentation. But thank you all very much for having me here. It's a great honor. It's certainly intimidating to be speaking on a panel with Professor Pestritto and Nick Eberstadt. If that weren't intimidating enough, my task is to talk about the politics of entitlement reform in a year where the Republican nominee for president differentiates himself from the Democrat by promising not to make any changes to the entitlement picture that we've just seen. Nonetheless, we will press ahead. So what I'd like to do is try to discuss this topic by focusing on three distinct but I think related tensions that inform our national conversation on entitlements. I think they predate 2016. I think they will live with us for far beyond 2016. And in understanding these three tensions, I hope to show that they work together to frustrate reform. And so therefore, those of us who are serious about rethinking these programs, preserving our promises to the elderly and the sick and the poor, are better off pursuing a bold and comprehensive conversation and reform approach to entitlements than we are a more piecemeal approach, like Simpson-Bowles or something smaller than that. The first tension that I'll discuss is the ideological tension. The difference between the mainstreams of the two parties, and actually I think there's a little bit more here. There's also, I think, important distinctions within each of the two parties in terms of how they would approach the purpose and the purpose of reform and these entitlement programs. The second tension is embedded in the language we use to talk about our entitlements finances. It's a tension between our entitlements fictional system of trust funds, whose assets are little more than IOUs, and the reality that entitlement shortfalls contribute to the federal deficit in the here and the now. For anyone who's planning on refilling their coffee or visiting the bathroom, the portion of my speech on accounting trust funds might be the appropriate time to do that. And the third tension is between our nation's political class. I certainly don't just mean politicians. I include all of us on the outside who are trying to advocate for change, and the public which recognizes the need for entitlement reform in the abstract, but is clearly quite skeptical of the solutions our political class is likely to pursue. These three tensions make any effort to reform entitlements extremely difficult. And I believe the most modest changes to the system, things like raising the retirement age, imposing minimal means testing, or further taxing those at the top, are actually likely to exacerbate the problems we face as much as any of them relieve these tensions. Think of a balloon being squeezed at one part as it expands elsewhere. For example, in framing entitlement reform as a modest problem of actuarial tweaks, we weaken the long-term case for the structural reforms that are also necessary. As such, I hope to convince you that the best political path forward is a more ambitious project, something similar to the one that then House Budget Chairman Paul Ryan embarked the Republican Party on in 2011. So let me circle back to our first tension, which is the tension between the vision of the right and the left regarding the purpose of reform, and the tension within both the right and the left to define it. Conservatives today know better than to assume that we can turn back the public against long-standing entitlements such as Medicare and Social Security. Remember, even Ronald Reagan felt the need to deflect in 1980 from his past opposition to Medicare. But it's hard to make the case for limited government and free markets without acknowledging the problematic nature of the programs we've inherited. First, because their top-down structure, prescriptive both in the benefit provision and of recipient consumption, is antithetical to free markets and limited government. And second, because their high costs make budget restraint impossible so long as they're not addressed. These two problems are in some ways complementary. So on the right, we have chosen to connect them by making the case for solvency and for structural reform at the same time when possible. The embodiment of this sort of approach was what Representative Ryan put forth with his premium support reform to Medicare. It would have offered seniors the ability to apply their Medicare dollars to the purchase of private health insurance, plans of their choosing, with the ability to pocket savings so as to encourage cost consciousness. But we've also seen the case for structural reforms can come into conflict with the work of addressing entitlements' near-term financing challenges. In this case, the proper conservative approach to reform is hardly obvious. This is particularly a problem in the context of Social Security. Unlike Medicare, which is a government-administered product, Social Security is merely a redistribution of dollars from the young to the old. Choice, in this context, cannot mean choice for the senior in the nature of the product received in old age. Rather, the period in which choice is a relevant consideration, is before his retirement, when he might be provided the freedom to save as he chooses so as not to be dependent on age-based government redistribution. But this raises a problem. Any effort to carve out private Social Security accounts from existing payroll receipts creates an immediate cash flow problem for the federal government and the Social Security Trust Fund. This generates complications in guaranteeing benefits to current retirees too old to benefit from the choice-based reforms, who have already built their plans around the guarantees they assumed their FICA contributions established. Intimidated by questions of how to make the financing work, and unskilled in making the case for a choice-based vision of entitlements on their own merits, conservative reformers tend to trip over themselves in efforts to square these circles. Thus, many entitlement reformers have chosen to abandon the effort to emphasize choice first and foremost in Social Security. Some have called for narrowing the program's financial commitments in the long term without undermining its short-term cash flow by reorienting Social Security to function more as a welfare program for the neediest seniors, and finding ways to encourage those with the means to save to do so on their own. Others, like Governor Kris have succeeded in carving out images for themselves as bold entitlement reformers on a platform of little more than actuarial tweaks to factors like eligibility age. From a budget-cutting perspective, there's certainly something conservative about these approaches to entitlement reform, and the call to save Social Security for those who need them most certainly has political utility. But the goal of choice and structural reform have clearly taken on a secondary role of importance in some corners of the conservative reform community. So that's the first half of our first tension, how those of us on the right envision entitlement reform. The second half of this tension is how the left thinks about it. As on the right, there are many on the left who in fact do believe in entitlement reforms, but their vision is very different, and the potential common ground is not easy to find. The progressive vision is most obvious when it comes to Medicare reform, for Medicare is the classic technocratic problem. It's a program built to solve an acute need, poverty among the elderly, that has come to dominate an enormous proportion of spending in a massive sector of the economy. Thus, the left's emphasis on Medicare reform is on sound management of that economic sector. For example, the reining in of so-called excessive payments to care providers. Invariably, the drive for efficiency entails some concessions to the reality that markets do in fact drive efficiencies, and the left will embrace competition in areas like bidding for medical equipment. But these proposals envision markets merely as a means to achieve highly prescriptive targets set by government, not as self-correcting mechanisms for addressing consumers' actual needs. And there is overlap here with conservative entitlement reforms who care primarily about making the numbers add up rather than market-oriented program restructuring. Overlap in openness to treating these programs as welfare initiatives first, not universal entitlements, though on the right, the emphasis is obviously on narrowing the program's scope, while on the left, the emphasis is increasing generosity to needing populations. Yet the overlap I've described is actually not universally shared on the left, a fact that reveals tension between the left's aspirations for entitlement reforms and the reality within which it must achieve them. For many on the left, entitlements are not merely a system of redistribution or income security. They're a system of social solidarity. Progressives look to countries like Denmark, and they see a model of generous universal entitlements that bind the people of the countries together, strengthening both internal comity and public support for program financing. As Joseph Stiglitz argued, we don't means test public education because we believe that we want people to have the same opportunities, and we lose out on that with means testing. Ideas like means testing that call the universality into question are therefore anathema, transforming politics of universal entitlements into the politics of welfare. These divergent perspectives are informed by a flawed system of trust fund accounting, which creates two parallel and completely incompatible accounting universes from which advocates on all sides can choose their favorite number. This is the second tension that needs to be understood. It's the tension between our entitlements fictional system of trust funds, assets are little more than IOUs, and the reality that entitlement shortfalls contribute to our federal deficit in the here and now. Social Security and Medicare are both dependent on trust funds supported by payroll tax paid over Americans' working lives. But these trust funds are accounted for within the unified federal budget, so-called because it unifies trust fund and non-trust fund finance programs. These trust funds are more accounting convention than lockbox. Trust fund surpluses are deposited in the Treasury, and the funds themselves record IOUs on their ledgers. There is no, as we all remember from the 2000 campaign, there's no Social Security vault in Washington which is carting out dollars to recipients until its coffers dry up. Thus, these programs do not merely contribute to our nation's fiscal bleeding on their dates of insolvency. They do so the moment they begin running annual shortfalls, all the while leaving Americans convinced they've paid into a system and are just receiving what they've put in. The general effect of this financing scheme has been to diminish aggregate federal deficits in the boom years, thanks to surpluses for programs like Social Security, thereby facilitating increased spending by taking pressure off of Washington to exercise fiscal restraint. As a result of that runaway spending, in our present moment, with these program bust years already here and deficits sky high, even independent of their future shortfalls, the government is in no position to pay the tab for the promises made over the decades, as was amply illustrated by Nick. Our entitlement financing through the unified budget now poses another challenge. Even having already done significant damage, it makes the potential savings that must be yielded through the necessary work of entitlement reform appear to be a piggy bank for politicians eager to further increase spending. This is exactly what happened with the passage of Obamacare, whose new spending was in large part offset by hundreds of billions of dollars separately claimed as Medicare trust fund savings. These dynamics put a number of burdens on reformers on both the right and the left. For budget hawks on the right, we find themselves facing liberal critics who argue, seemingly backed by official number of the program trustees, that the day of reckoning is years out, and arguments to the contrary are scaremongering. Mend it, don't end it, Chuck Schumer said in 2005. For structural reformers on the right, the problem cuts the other way. The fixation with trust fund balances makes talks of restructuring appear itself threatening to beneficiaries, who were brought in after years of FICA payments to the current system and unwilling to see these programs' revenues diverted to alternative models. But the model of trust fund accounting for these programs' finances actually handcuffs both sides, not just one, in making their case. For liberals, the need to demonstrate that the program can self-finance over an extended period clips their wings, making consideration of broad entitlement expansions politically fraught, as beneficiaries fear that new spending will crowd out old priorities dependent on the same sources of revenue. Let me now talk about our third tension. It's a tension between our nation's political class and the public, which recognizes the need for entitlement reform in the abstract, but is quite clearly skeptical of the solutions our political class is likely to pursue. In polling conducted at the height of the controversy over Paul Ryan's Medicare budget changes in 2011, the public demonstrated clear knowledge that the status quo is unsustainable. 67% of the public indicated they believe a crisis was either underway or imminent within a decade. Yet the appetite for reform that very same month was weak. Only 38% of Americans supported complete entitlement overhauls or major changes. So the traditional view of this, the conventional wisdom, is either that the American people are schizophrenic or that they're aware of the incongruence of their views and they're just completely intergenerationally selfish. Yet these poll numbers are produced in an environment where trust in large institutions is plummeting, and particularly trust in our political system is low. Who's to say these voters are telling us that they want to keep consuming, rather than just saying they have little trust Washington will not squander whatever savings are produced? Who's to say these voters are unaware of the incongruence of their policy views, rather than just utterly convinced the status quo is broken, but any attempt by these politicians to fix it will result in a bigger mess? This is particularly a problem on the right, where the general cynicism of public institutions has become more acute in recent years. I remind you again of Donald Trump's publicly articulated skepticism of Paul Ryan's agenda of entitlement reform. For some, the emergence of this cynicism is a surprise. The Tea Party, after all, was a movement foundationally committed to limited government and balanced budgets. But in 2016, many of these conservative voters embraced a candidate who openly campaigned against serious entitlement reform. The voters didn't seem to mind Trump's rebranding of single-payer Medicare as a model for conservative health policy. Why not? I think for anyone who saw the grassroots as simply concerned with limited government, there's little getting around this obvious dissonance. I believe, however, the answer is rooted in a particular brand of conservatism that was espoused by Tea Parties. As Emily Ekins of the Cato Institute has observed, by combing through polling and focus group data, these voters' preference for limited government is itself primarily driven by a reap-what-you-sow conception of economic justice, rather than as much Tea Party rhetoric proclaims a desire for individual liberty. Their views are rooted in a sense of basic economic fairness, that those who work to support themselves see their efforts appropriately recompensed, rather than have the fruits of their labors redistributed. These are not big government for thee, but not for me, but not for thee views, nor are they unachievable policy preferences. Our entitlement programs, financed on a pay-as-you-go basis, in fact, if not entirely in theory, pay beneficiaries far more than they put into the system, a fact many of them simply do not realize. So what I've tried to do today is show you how three tensions, an ideological tension between and within both the left and the right, an accounting tension caused by our nation's flawed system of budgeting, and a deficit of trust between the political class and voters, work together to complicate the politics of entitlement reform. Remember the balloon I discussed at the start, which expands elsewhere when squeezed in a single point. So, for example, President Bush's attempt to deal with the structure of Social Security was thwarted by, among many reasons, Senator Schumer's ability to leverage trust fund accounting to capitalize on the increased pressure on the public's skepticism of positive policy change, with his Mend It, Don't End It campaign. Similarly, efforts to apply means testing to benefits would relieve fiscal and public trust pressure on entitlements, but are greatly threatening to the left's ideological commitment to social solidarity. Governor Christie's exclusive focus on actuarial tweaks to entitlements make the project of structural change far more difficult. What then is the path forward? I believe the urgent task must be to close this trust gap with the American people. First, by explaining with greater clarity the flaws of our existing system, and second, by demonstrating our good intentions as reformers, not to undermine anybody's hard work, but to give them and their children the opportunity to receive all they have paid in and more without bankrupting the country. The model for such a conversation, as is often the case when it comes to entitlement reform, is the heroic effort undertaken by Paul Ryan over the early years of the Obama administration to pair a message of structural reform with the effort to sound the alarm bell of an impending fiscal crisis, to convince seniors that our task is to preserve these programs for future generations in improved form, not to undermine what is already theirs. Counterintuitively, piecemeal efforts at reform actually complicate that conversation relative to more comprehensive ideas, maintaining the incoherence of our current policy mix and preventing serious explanation by policymakers of their real intentions in pursuing reform. In outlining more comprehensive reforms of our entire system, including changes both to specific spending programs and to the tax code that finances them, we might better understand for ourselves and explain to the country what sorts of changes would constitute real progress and what changes would undermine our shared priorities. Openness and candor about the nature of our present situation and the shape of our long-term vision are the antidote to the distrust that has ground the politics of entitlement reform to a halt. With candor will come opportunities that are less obvious so long as we continue playing the shell game, forcing us by the flawed system of trust fund accounting, a system that suggests our status quo is more sustainable than is actually the case, and that unfairly biases the playing field against some ideas centered around choice and competition. And with candor will come a more honest assessment of our own part of the nature of the alternative presented by the left, an alternative that should sharpen our arguments and help us explain the real choices available to the American people. The work will not be easy. That's because the central task we have ahead of us is not to force our will, but to generate consensus, to persuade. Only in doing that can we close this trust gap and make real entitlement reform possible. Thank you. My president.
Thank you. We are going into questions. We have a little under half an hour, so if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and a Hillsdale student will come up to you with a microphone right here in front.
On the principle and the growth and the politics of entitlement, could you compare and contrast with, number one, the pigs in Europe, for example, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain? They are all in trouble. And number two, compare with China. In 1978, they initiated capitalism, and now 600 million people have been lifted out of poverty and, of course, entitlement. Can we learn something from all these countries?
Dick, do you want to do that one, I think?
I'll take a first crack at that. I think that not just talking about the pigs countries, but talking about the European countries in general, the welfare states in the European countries, is very instructive in comparison to the U.S. There are some people who snob and sneer at the concept of American exceptionalism, but there really is such a thing as American exceptionalism, and it has to do with the philosophical principles of the American founding and on certain values that drew people to becoming Americans. And I'd make the point that the American traditional concept of poverty and its causes was radically different from the traditional concept of poverty and its causes in the European states where the welfare entitlement states were initially born. Bismarck's Germany and Beveridge's Britain and Sweden's Third Way and all of that sort of stuff. And to be horribly oversimplistic about it, in continental Europe and in other parts of Europe, the concept of poverty and its causes had a great deal to do with the class nature of their societies, that people were born through no fault of their own into a rigid system where they could only advance so far, and implicitly the state was going to try to compensate for these barriers. Whereas, to oversimplify horribly, in the United States there was the concept that opportunity was almost unlimited and that people had, through their own initiative, a range of untrammeled opportunities. So the European welfare state coming to the United States is really like sort of a horrible medical operation of transplant to a somewhat unsuitable patient, if you see what I mean. Although our values have perhaps been transmuted to some degree by this transplant operation, I think you will find that more Americans today than in the past, if we could get poll numbers for this, would say that they see themselves as being limited by dint of birth in terms of their opportunities. China's a very different case. And of course, China's economic expansion, ascendance since the 1978 third plenum of the Ninth Communist Party meeting, whichever one it was in December of 78, has been unlike anything the world has ever seen. But China is still in many ways a poor state. It certainly has a rather limited welfare set of provisions, as anybody who is elderly and rural in China will be acutely aware. And I think most fundamentally the big difference is with regard to rule of law and individual rights and trust of the state. There's still an enormous chasm there. However, one may look at certain aspects of steps of progress in China, and that's just the rule of law and the trust in government is just so fundamentally different in the Chinese situation.
Can I add to that? So just to back up Nicholas's point there, from a more philosophic angle, he mentioned the old traditional American understanding, and you asked the question, what happened in America? So I talked in my remarks about the New Deal and about the progressive era. What happened to sort of lay the ground for that sort of change in thinking from what we had prevailing in the preceding century? And what you see is a very striking difference in the 19th century, especially when you look at higher education. So you take a look at higher ed or the college in America in, say, 1860 and compare it to higher education in 1900, and you have the educational elites in America that become very, very populated. The best places become very populated with our elites who went over to Europe and got themselves advanced degrees. So if you wanted to get an advanced degree in the United States back in the middle of the 19th century, you went to Europe to get it, very often to Germany. And this is how you get coming into the traditional American understanding of liberty, of social contract, natural rights, and all of that. You have it replaced with the German idea of the state. And so you have very traditional, for example, very traditional universities and colleges with traditional boards of trustees, but they do the trendy thing, or they want to do the trendy thing, they want to be elite, and they go out and get themselves a bunch of European PhDs when they're hiring their faculties in the latter part of the 19th century. And the result is, by the time you get higher education, you get the places where all the elites are going for their education in America around the turn of the century. It's essentially as if the air and the water have changed in the United States in terms of how people think, and some of these changes were mentioned, to where the progressive lingo is just everywhere. And you mentioned Bismarck's Prussia. I mean, Woodrow Wilson's vision for transforming administration and bureaucracy in America, he was a tremendous admirer of Bismarck and the Prussian bureaucratic model. So.
This one, I'm sorry. This one and then, yeah.
Yes, Stephen Phillips, Belhaven University. Are we really just, aren't we really just sort of treading water and about to sink? With entitlement programs that are just about broke, with pension programs that are completely broke, and with our federal government, especially central banks and all over the world, buying up government bonds, we're not really paying the way. Are we just really one step away from the collapse of say, the Weimar Republic?
I mean, I'll let Nick talk about how close the collapse is. I mean, we are clearly on an unsustainable path. I think we have enough time to start getting some of this stuff right. And if we don't do it in the amount of time we have allocated, then certainly bond markets will do it for us, and we'll be forced to make difficult decisions. But I mean, I actually think when you look at these programs, I feel very confident on Medicare reform, where I think because we at one point had united the allegedly conservative party in this country around Paul Ryan's vision of Medicare reform, I think we have the opportunity to educate our fellow citizens. I think that with education is how you actually get something passed. I think all the good examples of positive policy victories the last couple of decades, something like welfare reform, was won by taking the case to the American people, bringing it with Charles Murray's work in a new way, how we're talking about the issue, and I think very similarly to how we're approaching Medicare. I think if you look at missile defense, that's something that prior to the Obama administration was a policy victory we had pretty much won by taking a compelling case to the American people. And I think in general, when we take our compelling case, and because we're correct on the right, our case when made is compelling, I think we can get it done. And so I think when you kind of look through the picture, I think that's one where we do have a good chance of getting positive Medicare reforms done in time before the situation that you've laid out. I feel similarly on Social Security reform. I think that what's more likely to happen is kind of the opportunity for a structural choice-based reform to Social Security will be lost because we'll essentially throw in our hand before trying to make the case. And you'll get some sort of Chris Christie style or Bowles-Simpson style actuarial tweaks. We'll raise the retirement age. It'll solve some of the financing problems that you allude to, but it won't do anything to get at kind of the human flourishing aspects of what we want public policy to do. What really scares me is the rest of the entitlement picture, the stuff that Nick writes about in his new book. And just, I mean, there is a social decay that conservatives are very good at talking about when it comes to the inner city, but is actually happening all through our country. That when you read Hillbilly Elegy, which if anybody hasn't, you need to, or Nick's new book, there is a social disconnectedness amongst many, many people who are now on these means-tested entitlement reforms. And that's the one where I don't know how we convince a reliable Republican voter in Alabama who is on the dole just as much as the populations we're more comfortable talking about. I think that's the one where I don't see the near-term or medium-term solution. And that's really, of all of this, what scares me the most.
That's it. We have to believe in American exceptionalism if we hope that we can reform our entitlement state before disaster, because there's been no example of any other country doing so unless they, as Margaret Thatcher would have said, somehow ran out of other people's money at the time. That's the Swedish example. That's the New Zealand example. I think maybe you could pick other examples. If what Paul Ryan calls the bond market vigilantes were to rescue us, that would in a sense be a much happier solution than some other visions that I can see looking towards the future. We usually just look at public borrowing, but the United States has an enormously high ratio of total credit to GDP. Not as high as Britain or some other places, but it's very, very high compared just to our public credit. And there's enormous scope for government entitlement programs expansion, crowding out the private sector, crowding out mortgage credit, crowding out investments for our business. I mean, think how that's going to work, but it could happen. And in addition to all of that, unlike any other society at the moment, we've got the world's reserve currency. So we can debase the world's reserve currency for a while until that privilege or responsibility is taken away from us. Which is to say, I think that unless we proceed down the path that Mike is outlining for us, there are a lot of bad things that can happen to us and a lot of scary things that can happen to our kids and grandkids.
Yes, is there any evidence on how many people, how many of the men who drop out of the formal workforce take their disability and just continue working in the underground economy? I mean, that would be a clever way, or a pretty obvious way, of eliminating that high marginal tax that people on welfare and other assistance programs avoid, the marginal tax. Is there any evidence on that?
There's not nearly as much evidence as you might expect, Professor Lee. I mean, you'd think that someone in the government would be interested in that question, but apparently our statisticians aren't quite as keen on that as some other questions. The IRS believes that there's a couple of $1 billion, and for the IRS, a couple of $1 billion is now small change in undeclared income from this non-working population. Alan Kruger came out with a paper, as you may have seen this week, where he suggests that maybe up to half of the army of 7 million prime-age men who are neither working nor looking for work were on pain medication the previous day to that survey. If they're working and earning a living and on pain medication, I don't know exactly how well they're doing at that. My guess is that there's some moonlighting, but that it wouldn't be equivalent to full-time income plus a disability benefit for most of the people in question.
Bill Penn, Belhaven University. I wonder if this is part of a bigger issue in our society, and that issue is trust. You know, we have on our coins, "In God we trust." We trust God because He always keeps His word. However, we say that one of the ways to keep your word is be careful how you give it, what you say. And so if we look at this from the standpoint of being careful what we promise in terms of entitlements, and then if we do overpromise, in other words, even if as a household we overspend, we have to make adjustments on our other spending and on our income to try to pay for that promise that we should not have made. Now, again, the new form of slavery in our society, as you know, is indebtedness. And we see this not only in the public sector, but in the private sector, and I think they reinforce one another. In other words, the private sector says, well, look what the public sector's doing, and the public sector says, well, the private sector is doing it too. And so we need to get at that point where we investigate more thoroughly our spending. We need to, as has been said, we need to look at the moral hazard of spending. Should we, when there's a budget, should there be a short-term and a long-term effect of spending? And then, of course, the question is, how are we going to pay for this indebtedness that we have? What kind of a plan? Are we going to pay for it within the next 10 years? Is it going to be a slower process, 25 years? But we need some of these actions. We need some of this detail, more than just general programs and general theory. I understand that that's important, but we need the detail. And again, we need to set the right example, the example set by our Lord Jesus.
Good. We've got details. Mike, I'm sure you've got some plans.
Yeah, no, I think the first thing is the trust deficit that you talked about. Part of the reason Donald Trump got the nomination is he quite correctly went out there and said, look, Washington is corrupt and it's working well for the well-connected, and I'm not corrupt, and so elect me. And people said, they looked at this and said, look, Washington is in fact a corrupt town where people like Hillary Clinton, everything going on with the foundation. Where that applies to entitlement spending is about 10 years ago, Heritage and Brookings went around the country doing what we called the fiscal wake-up tour. And we would go on college campuses, and you'd get college kids to show up because it was on campus, and then you'd get older people from the community coming. And we would sit down, we'd say, look, here's an economist from the Heritage Foundation, here's an economist from Brookings. These are the numbers as to what is coming with regards to our entitlement spending. And people would look around, and they'd see somebody next to them who either was their grandkid or looked like their grandkid, and people were completely willing to consider the types of changes. Heritage has plans, AEI has plans, there's plenty of plans that are out there, if they actually trust that the politicians in Washington will use those savings to actually provide a better future for their grandchild. It's not what they expect. If you're on the left, You assume that if you cut entitlements, the right will waste this on foreign adventures abroad. If you're on the right, you assume that the left will waste this on foreign aid or whatever you think the left is wasting money on. And so there isn't that kind of public trust that allows the public to actually contemplate changes to these programs, knowing that the politicians will use this to make this country stronger in the future. And so, I think the trust deficit, we can put out the plans. Heritage has a great plan. It's called Saving the American Dream. It tries to do kind of this comprehensive reform that I talked about of tackling the tax code and entitlements and everything else at the same time. But I think the first thing we have to be willing to do is go to the American people and say, if we're asking you to make changes to these sacred programs that you're relying on, maybe GE should not pay a 0% marginal tax rate. Maybe JP Morgan shouldn't be able to look at the Export-Import Bank and call it free money for Wall Street. Maybe we should look at some of this kind of endemic corruption and cronyism that goes on in Washington and rebuild frayed trust, which is frayed rightly so because Washington is in fact corrupt.
Nick?
I think Ron could probably speak to what I'm going to attempt to say much more eloquently than my stumbling attempt will be. But what Mike is talking about, and what I think your comments get to the heart of, is the health of the American conception of self-reliance. I mean, we have a long history of enshrining the principle of self-reliance, but it's not quite as healthy or as popular as it was in some earlier times. And part of that is because the concept of the primacy of individual agency, of the extent to which one's individual actions are seen as determining one's outcome or one's fate, has lowered in relation to some other sorts of theories or concepts, more deterministic theories that suggest that we are all helpless victims of impersonal and enormous social forces. And if we are all victims of enormous social forces beyond our control, well, what the heck? Let's go for the debt, right? But if we do believe that there is something to be said for self-reliance and for individual agency, then, with trust, I think we've got a great case to make.
Archie.
I guess I would just add, I hope Mike is right. I hope his account of where at least some people are in their ability, to their receptiveness to the hard reality of our situation, their willingness to be responsible. I hope that's right. I think the only way we can act is on that assumption. I worry that he might not be, or that he might not be right about a sufficient size of a sufficient portion of our population. There are lots of things to be demoralized about in the culture. When you look at the college students, not our college students, by the way, but and they're whining for safe spaces and the constant, crying like victims. It makes me worry Mike might not be right about that, but I hope he is. I think the only hope we have is to act on the assumption that he is. When you have people like FDR telling you since the 1930s that the government is going to give you security, and by security he doesn't mean we're going to spend on defense and protect you from our foreign enemies. He means freedom from having to worry about old age and unemployment, and as if that can be provided, and that is inculcated over decades and decades. It doesn't surprise me to see the situation and the culture that we see today. So I hope my pessimism isn't such an accurate picture of things.
I have a pessimistic speech, but the panel was just so depressing that I decided to add it.
Next question. Oh, over here. Sorry.
I noticed that nobody on the panel emphasized demographic issues, and this is more acute in Japan, probably mainland China eventually, Taiwan, my other home, some countries in Europe. Is this not an issue for the United States, or is it more of an issue than what you guys talked about? And if it is an issue, here in the U.S., we have typically said, well, we can always import more people. In other words, increase immigration. Would that be necessary? Would we be able to perhaps partner up with other countries with different demographics and pool these risks a little bit more than we do just on the Treasury bond market?
Great
Thanks.
question.
Any comments at all?
Nick, start with you.
Okay, very briefly. So Japan is a shrinking and aging society that seems to be on the course to heading back to Amaterasu and going back up to heaven. Okay, so it's a net mortality, shrinking, aging society. I'm not as pessimistic as you might think when I describe it that way, because there's a lot of promise and hope, I think, still left in Japan. Japan's the healthiest society on earth. It's a technological leader. As long as its governmental social welfare systems do not remain fixed in 20th century form but can adapt with the population, I think there's a future for a smaller, healthy, grayer Japan that's prosperous. My own demographic vision for the United States, actually, I kind of like to think of NAFTA land. I like to think of Mexico plus Canada plus the U.S. If you look at this as a demographic aggregate or as an economic zone, the thing which is really shocking, perhaps, is how much improvement there has been in Mexico over the last generation in human resources. The gap in life expectancy between Mexico and the U.S. is about the same as between the U.S. and Canada nowadays. And I can't vouch for Mexican education, but I can tell you that there's a lot of it. There are more, the number of average years of college training for a Mexican 20-something is higher than that for Germany. So there are lots of human resources around, and I think that there's lots of potential.
Let's get another question.
I was hoping maybe you could speak to the kind of mechanics of the problem that we're seeing. I'm often confused by one of the statements you made, Nick, about how we seem healthier than ever before, and yet we have more and more people claiming disability. How is that happening? I know people who struggle to get onto disability, even though they are really disabled. So are we merely, is it a sense of corruption that's just happening within the government and who they're passing the benefits out to? Are we redefining what we mean by disabled? Are we redefining poverty? Like, how is this process happening?
All right, I think that'll be our last question, and who on the panel would like to address that?
Well, there's not a single standard definition across the country, and of course we have a nightmare panoply of different disability programs. It's not just Social Security disability insurance, it's SSI, it's veterans disability, and other things that are in this archipelago. And there isn't any sort of standard approach from one part of the country to the next. What we can see from looking at, nor is there any sort of auditing approach of this. So we're kind of like lost in the sea of anecdote here, unfortunately. And there obviously are people who are disabled and need benefit from programs that are supposed to be benefiting disabled people. That's why they were presumably established. What we can see is that, at least for SSDI, the two real growth areas over the last generation have been what's called musculoskeletal disorders and psychiatric disorders or psychological disorders. Now, one thing I can tell you about tuberculosis is when you go to a doctor can tell you if you have TB or not. Two things that a doctor cannot tell you is whether or not your back hurts and whether or not you're having sad feelings. So there's an enormous gray area out there, and it has coincided with this great expansion of disability programs.
Please join me in thanking this great panel.